From Argus Media, this is Driving Discussions, a podcast series focusing on the forces that affect North American road fuels. Greetings and salutations, one and all. Jason Metko with you yet again, Associate Editor of U.S. Products at Argus. And today we're at the Argus Crude Summit, and we're talking the Bakken with John Argo, Vice President, Williston Basin of Continental Resources. John, it is indeed a high honor to have you on Driving Discussions. Thank you so much for joining the podcast here today. I know you're a busy man, so we'll get right to it as we're talking the Bakken here today. First, I guess, for those maybe unfamiliar with the region, I know there's been a bit of talk about it, but can you give us a bit of a brief oral history of what's transpired in the Bakken?
Well, thank you first for having me here. I really appreciate you. Apologies, I'm dealing with a little allergies today, so my first podcast ever, and I'm dealing with a voice that's not my normal voice. But no, thank you again for having me. The Bakken is phenomenal. I've been in the oil and gas industry about 20 years now, and that's around the same time as what the Bakken has evolved from. Continental Resources, I've been there for 10 years, so I've been around the Bakken very directly for that time period. But going back to the early days of just after the turn of the century, it was companies like Continental and others that had to really unlock this phenomenal resource that we know today, but was unknown from the perspective of the productivity, the economics, and ultimately all that's come with it. So those early days wells were done with technology of open hole completions, pump and praise, shorter laterals, just nowhere near what we've been able to evolve to in 2025. Those early days ultimately saw a lot of failures, but the successes that the teams continued to grow from and drive from led to a boom that saw over 200 rigs drilling in the Bakken. Now what's amazing is you're seeing today we have a fraction of that rig count, 40 or so rigs drilling, but yet today we're still growing production in the Williston with a fraction of those rigs. So we saw the 1 mile laterals turn into today 3 to 4 mile laterals are becoming more and more the norm. You saw Middle Bakken only development early days to now you've seen Three Forks evolve, and then Three Forks 2 and 3 evolve, and the teams of Continental, but also the whole industry continue to find ways to unlock more of this awesome resource at a more and more capitally efficient manner. And so, today at roughly 1.3 million barrels a day from the Williston, with like I said, a very modest rig count from historical perspectives, we still see the Bakken growing, and that's just a testament to the technology evolution. But yet we still have, I think, a long ways to go to continue to see that as evolution, that technology improve.
You and I were talking before we started this podcast. I had served some time in North Dakota doing small town radio on the eastern side of the state, but I saw when the fracking boom happened in the late aughts, the big thing back then was the infrastructure just wasn't there. Can you speak as to how that looks right now?
I think we look pretty well from an infrastructure perspective. There was a lot built out before we saw the downturn from 2014. And I think the Williston has benefited from that build out that was intentional. We didn't anticipate the price crash from post 2014 that happened, that really slowed activity down all across the Williston and all across the industry. But we've been able to leverage that infrastructure for the past decade. Now, I think there's some good projects that teams are doing that are continuing to help solve bottlenecks where they come up, and obviously we and our peers on the upstream side work really closely with the midstream partners to make sure we have that. But crude I think looks pretty good for the growth we're seeing, the ability to continue to move that. NGLs and natural gas are a little bit tighter, but I do think that we still feel good that there's good projects in place that are going to be able to help us move those precious molecules whenever growth continues to show.
We are talking the Bakken here with John Argo, Vice President, Williston Basin Continental Resources at the Argus Crude Summit on this edition of Driving Discussions. Politics has been in the news, obviously, for quite some time here. It seems like we've always got a presidential election cycle. Now we have the return of President Trump. Can you speak as to how things have played out in the region from Trump 1.0 to Joe Biden and now that Trump's back in office?
Well, I think, we hear a lot about it, and for good reason. Our industry is so critical. Energy drives everything. And we're so blessed to have the American energy resources that we do, not only from the oil and gas in the ground, but also the ecosystem, the talented men and women, the service sector, the infrastructure, you name it, right? It allows us to access this phenomenal resource that we have in our country, and that helps our country with low cost of energy, abundant energy. And you look at when the administration is aligned with providing that energy and allowing that energy to flow, if you will, and to grow, to provide what it can for both us and our globe. It's awesome to see. We have been under administration the past 4 years that ultimately was not pro our industry and did work many different ways to try to limit the growth of it. And I think that showed up in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, I think we still, in spite of that, the industry finds ways to grow and evolve and leverage more technology and be efficient, which is why we've been able to see production continue to grow, even with an administration that did not want to see us thrive, if you will. But today, I think under the Trump administration, we are incredibly excited. President Trump, he gets it. He surrounds himself with individuals who gets it. The Secretary Wright and Secretary Burgum, those individuals specifically really encourage me, because they understand our industry so well, and the positions that they're in are so influential with the Interior and with DOE. We're just really, really excited about it, because I think ultimately we have more. We have more resource. We have the opportunity to do even more. The collaboration, doing smart, appropriate regulation, allowing more infrastructure to be built out, allowing access to lands that can be leveraged, ultimately is going to make it even more abundant, more beneficial to both the United States and to our friends around the world.
You mentioned some of the objectives. Is there a primary objective that you believe needs to get done here in the next year or so?
I think that ultimately we do need more infrastructure. I think that Secretary Wright has been, noted in saying drill baby drill is one thing, but build baby build is maybe even more important. So I think that on allowing that infrastructure to be built, there are projects that are good, that are needed, and if we can allow a system that does not get in the way of that and not inhibit that, but appropriately facilitate that and encourage that, I think that's probably the single biggest thing that I see. There's a lot going on though, we're just encouraged to take the thumb off of it and let energy grow.
A couple more moments here with our guest, John Argo, Vice President, Williston Basin Continental Resources, on this edition of Driving Discussions. This particular podcast, we focus on road fuels. So my next question is regarding gasoline and diesel fuel. How does what we see in the Bakken play out here the next, 6 months, a year, to what's going on with gasoline and diesel prices? Because right now they are, I guess you could say, somewhat low. Others would like to see it go lower. It could be worse. It could be $4 or $5 a gallon. Thankfully, we're not there anymore. Where do you see all of this coming together when it comes to what folks are going to pay at the pump, John?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know if I'm qualified to answer it very effectively.
Okay.
I'm an engineer by background and more in the operations, but I think that I don't want to do a bad job of answering that question. I would be encouraged that we have the supplies in the United States to continue to appropriately grow production. I think that once again, back to an appropriate regulatory environment that can pull inefficiencies, time, waste out of the system, I would be encouraged that would show up in all Americans in overall lower energy cost. So that encourages me.
Last one for you, John. How do you and the industry best go about presenting the future of the industry as an all-encompassing one? Because we hear some folks say that alternative energies aren't going to work. Some say we need to focus on those. How do we find the middle ground there?
I agree. I think that energy demand is growing, and it's growing at a pace that is encouraging and exciting, but it's also a little daunting. When you look at on the natural gas and the power side with what we're seeing in AI, and we're early into this wave of AI, but some of the forecasts of power demand growth are really astonishing, astounding, and it's going to take all forms of energy to allow us to meet the demands of the future energy demands. I think that one thing also just that I'm encouraged by or excited by, specifically in the Williston and the Baaken, but also if you look at just the shale reservoirs across the lower 48, we're 20 couple decades into this really energy renaissance of horizontal drilling that's unlocked this phenomenal shale resource. And these rocks are tough, right? These rocks are tight. These rocks are, in a lot of cases expensive to get to. The things that our industry does are really phenomenal. But that being said, all that we do, the Williston, for example, we are, roughly a lot of forecasts, our company included, put maybe 50,000 wells can be drilled eventually in the Williston, horizontal wells to effectively, produce from the Williston, the Bakken Three Forks.
Yeah.
We're maybe, 40% through that to date. So we got a lot of wells left to drill. But even after all the wells we've drilled to date, and the next, call it 30 or so thousand wells that we will drill, and even after we let those produce for 50 years, approximate, well life,
yeah,
we're only going to get maybe 10% of the oil out of that reservoir.
And the reason why?
It's a challenging technology to essentially exploit something that's got the reservoir pressure at day one is the greatest it'll ever be. Every day you're producing a barrel, you're most likely going to produce less the next day, and that loss of reservoir pressure is probably the single biggest drive. But ultimately, we use the term recovery factor, a 10% recovery factor on a field that has maybe 100 billion barrels in it, right? So if we get the 10 billion barrels out, that's a lot. That's great. We've consumed 5 billion barrels to date. But ultimately, is that an efficient use of that phenomenal resource? We've got to find a way to do better. And we are, and we will. But that really excites me and encourages me. Like I said, I've been in this business about 20 years. I had folks that told me 20 plus years ago when I was going into petroleum engineering, I don't know what you're going to do in that field. The industry in the United States is declining. I hope you like to travel because you're going to be working internationally. I had some great leaders of the industry that were kind enough to give me advice. And I remember one of them that was encouraging me to go into this phenomenal field that I've loved and been blessed to be a part of. He told me a few years ago, he says, John, and he knows my dad too, he said, Little John, if you'd have told me, or if anybody had told me that you would have spent your entire career living in Oklahoma and working in other places, but living in Oklahoma essentially, he says, I would have lost that bet every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So, but why? That's because of the energy renaissance, horizontal drilling, unlocking this massive resource we have, but yet all the technology we've advanced, all the benefits that we see, and we see it every day, we keep getting better, our teams keep getting better. We're still only forecasting to get, once again, maybe 10% of that oil out of the ground. So that excites me. We're going to find new technologies, whether it's enhanced oil recovery technologies, which us and our industry are piloting, or something that we don't even know yet today. But the minds that are coming out, the students that are going into these programs today in geology and engineering and other even computer science and leveraging technology in that way, that really excites me.
Well, speaking of getting better, your voice got better throughout this. Excellent job for your first ever podcast. John, thank you so much for the time. We really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.
Great many thanks to our guest today, John Argo, the Vice President, Williston Basin of Continental Resources, live from the Argus Crude Summit here in Houston. And that'll do it for this edition of Driving Discussions, a production of Argus Media, a leading independent provider of pricing and commodity market information. Make sure to check out the previous episodes in our series, and for the latest and greatest when it comes to all things U.S. products, make sure you subscribe to the daily Argus Media U.S. Products Report.